Hello everyone, it's Alexander, the real Mr. Robinson. Welcome to the channel. So this is a video that I've actually been wanting to make ever since the new year started. Because even though we're in 2021, I think a lot of people would just like to forget about the last year, even though all the problems from last year have still bled over into this year. And one of the things that still hasn't changed since last year is that movie theaters are still closed. But to be honest, compared to a majority of the shit that happened in 2020, theaters being closed is probably the least consequential thing that happened. But there actually is something positive to come out of this from my end. And I use that word positive lightly because nothing was really positive in 2020. Because one of the things that happened due to movie theaters being closed is that it gave me an opportunity to catch up on a lot of classic movies that I have never seen before. And I'm talking about movies from 30 or more years ago that A, I've probably never heard about, or B, these massive titans of cinema that I just never saw for whatever reason. Since I didn't do a full top 10 list of the best of and worst of movies in 2020, I did a top 5 for both, which you can see right here. I'm going to dedicate this video to talking about the 10 movies that I discovered for the first time in 2020. Now, most of the movies on this list I have reviewed on the channel, and some of them I haven't. So there are going to be a few surprises, but if you follow me on my Letterboxd account, then you might get an idea of what movies I'm going to talk about. And also, this list is in no particular order whatsoever. With the exception of the number 1 movie, these are not ranked in terms of least favorite to favorite. I just can't do that for these movies because they're all pretty great in my opinion. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. These are my top 10 discoveries of 2020. Number 10. Splendor in the Grass from 1961, starring Natalie Wood and Warren Beatty. I had no idea what this movie was going into it. There was a tiny point last year, mainly thanks to the HBO documentary, where Natalie Wood kind of had a slight resurgence. And this movie, Splendor in the Grass, came out in 1961, the same year that West Side Story came out. Both of these movies put Natalie Wood on the map as no longer being the child actress that people were familiar with. And she is fantastic in this movie. Warren Beatty's also really good as well in his feature film debut. And one of the things that kind of shocked me, yet not shocked me at the same time, was how dark this movie can get. This is a movie about a teenage girl who feels suppressed by her family, and she just has all these nervous breakdowns. It can be pretty stressful to watch, and it's probably not a movie that I would really want to rewatch anytime soon. And the reason I say I'm kind of not surprised by this aspect is because this is how teen movies were in the 50s and 60s. While most teen movies made today are usually comedies, sometimes straightforward comedies or just dramedies, teen movies back in the day were straight up dramas, and they could get incredibly heavy. But this movie is definitely fantastic, one that I had not heard about until I just watched it for the first time last year. Number 9. Singing in the Rain, one of the most classic Hollywood musicals ever made. I don't think I quite love this movie as I would have if I'd seen it earlier, and part of that has to do with the fact that this movie and The Artist have pretty much the same plot. I mean, The Artist, you could argue that's a remake of Singing in the Rain, right down to the fact that Jean Dujardin looks exactly like Gene Kelly. But still, regardless of this movie feeling similar to another movie that I love, it's still fantastic. The dance sequences are just jaw-droppingly amazing. The cast is spot on. It has this beautiful, colorful look to it. The actual Singing in the Rain sequence itself is one of the greatest dance numbers in motion picture history. It's just absolutely fantastic. There's only a handful of problems that I have with this movie, and most of them can be attributed to, well, it was a different time, so I'm not going to really lean too hard on the problems. I've already reviewed this movie when I saw it last year, so you can check that out for yourself, but still, this is a great classic. Number 8. When Harry Met Sally. Probably Rob Reiner's best movie with the exception of The Princess Bride. Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan are absolutely fantastic in this movie, and it's a romantic comedy between two best friends that are of the opposite sex. Even though this movie came out over 30 years ago, I don't think it's an aspect that gets talked about very often, at least in film, and the friendship slash romance is very believable between these two characters. There's some great dialogue scattered here and there. The supporting cast is great, especially Carrie Fisher. It's a very realistic and down-to-earth film with nothing that I could really see as being too far-fetched or too out there. I love this movie. It's a great feel-good movie of the 80s and one that I really am sad that I didn't see until just recently. Number 7. Arthur. Talk about a movie that gives you a really bad impression at first, but then it quickly saves itself to be a great comedy. Dudley Moore's fantastic as this drunk billionaire Arthur, and again, when the movie starts out, I wasn't really into it because I thought the entire thing was just going to be the drunken Dudley Moore show, and it starts out like that, but as the movie progresses, you realize that there's more to this character. He's not just a one-trick joke. Liza Minnelli's fantastic as well. And John Gielgud as Arthur's butler is amazing. Like, there's a reason why this guy won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor when it came out. It's funny, it's heartfelt, and after seeing it, I definitely feel confident in saying that it's one of the best comedies of the 80s. Number 6. Dirty Dancing. This is a movie that I haven't reviewed on the channel, but the great thing about these being older movies is that I don't feel like there's a time crunch to actually review them. So one day I'll review Dirty Dancing, but for right now, this is another movie, much like with Arthur, where I thought it was going to be one thing and then ends up being something so much better than you could ever imagine it to be. When you look at this movie on the outside, you think it's just going to be about dancing, and that's what I thought, but one thing I didn't expect from the movie is its social commentary on different social classes, how people are treated when it comes to different societies, how some are looked down by others. It gets surprisingly deep, and it has some real emotion to it. But I never feel like it's in your face, and it doesn't distract you at all from the amazing dance sequences in this movie. Both Patrick Swayze and Jennifer Grey are fantastic together, even though apparently these two actors hated each other on set. The dance choreography is outstanding, and much like with the iconic Singing in the Rain sequence, the ending to this movie is one of the most iconic dance numbers in cinema. Dirty Dancing is fantastic, and now I finally know the origins of the line, "Nobody puts baby in a corner." Number 5. Some Like It Hot. I have seen most of Billy Wilder's iconic films, from Double Indemnity, Sunset Boulevard, and my favorite of his, The Apartment, but for some reason Some Like It Hot was a movie that I just didn't get around to until last year. And hey, surprise, surprise, it's a fantastic Billy Wilder movie. I still like The Apartment more, but much like with Dirty Dancing, there was a lot in this movie that I did not expect when I originally watched it. For one, I didn't expect it to be a period piece set in the 20s, considering it was a movie made in the 50s. I did not expect these two characters to actually be on the run from assassins, and they pretty much cross-dress and head to Miami as part of a women's band. Your three actors are fantastic. Jack Lemmon, Tony Curtis, Marilyn Monroe. They all have great chemistry with each other. There's some great dialogue. And much like with The Apartment, the movie ends with such a perfect final line, which I won't say in this video, and I didn't say in my original review, just because if you haven't seen this movie, it's too good of a line to spoil. So if you haven't seen Some Like It Hot, please check it out. And that goes for all the movies I'm talking about here. And I still like The Apartment more, but this might be my second favorite Billy Wilder film. Number 4. Cabaret, the movie that was the biggest competition for The Godfather when it came to the Academy Awards in 1972. I love Bob Fosse's All That Jazz. It's one of my favorite movies of all time, but Cabaret is pretty fantastic as well. And part of it has to do with, again, the fact that I didn't know what to expect from this movie. I figured it was a musical because it was Bob Fosse. With the way Liza Minnelli looks in this movie, I kind of expected it to take place in the 20s or 30s, but I didn't expect it to be as dark as it was. I didn't expect it to tackle a subject matter of Nazis rising to power and how Germany just kind of falls into place and accepts it. There's a lot in this movie that is very mature for being a standard musical, which again, when you compare this movie to All That Jazz, Bob Fosse is very good at tackling these heavy subject matters into really upbeat musicals in a way. And the song sequences are great. Liza Minnelli is just fantastic in this role, and this was the year between this movie and Arthur where I really got a sense of who Liza Minnelli was. Joel Grey is fantastic as well, and I actually didn't know this, but he is the father to Jennifer Grey, who I just talked about in Dirty Dancing. So that's an interesting connection. But anyway, he's great in this movie. I will still stand by the fact that I don't think Michael York is that strong in this movie, and Liza Minnelli just kind of acts circles around him. But regardless of that, with what this movie actually has to offer and sort of the manner that I saw this movie, I felt like I was taken to a completely different world, and I was just totally invested in Cabaret. Number 3. Terms of Endearment. Last year I reviewed James L. Brooks and Jack Nicholson's last movie, How Do You Know?, which I think is terrible. And with Terms of Endearment, I thought it was going to be a really straightforward comedy, because my main exposure to James L. Brooks was his association with The Simpsons as an executive producer. But I did not expect this movie to make me tear up as much as it did, because holy crap, if you look at this movie thinking, oh, it's James L. Brooks who produced The Simpsons, this is going to be a laugh-out-loud comedy, then you might want to get those tissues ready, because the end of the movie will just give you Niagara Falls syndrome, as in, you'll be crying your eyes out. I did not expect this movie to be as emotional as it was. Deborah Winger, Shirley MacLaine, and Jack Nicholson are all fantastic. Shirley MacLaine and Deborah Winger's chemistry as mother and daughter is strong. It's very believable. And the movie's story about a family splitting apart and then coming back together through unusual circumstances, whether they be tragic or not, is powerful. And again, the end of the movie, I really was trying to hold back tears when the movie ended. And there's a reason why this movie won Best Picture. Like, it's fantastic. And again, if you've never seen this movie and you don't know much about it, then I will be shocked if you make it to the end of this movie and you are not a sobbing mess. Number 2. The Godfather Part 2. Yeah, that's right. I have never seen The Godfather Part 2 up until last year, 2020. I've seen the first Godfather beforehand because I own the trilogy on Blu-ray, but it just took me a long time for me to actually get around to The Godfather Part 2, and I saw this movie through AMC throughout 2 days, because this movie's over 3 hours long, because there were commercials when I watched this movie, and wow, is it amazing. Like, I love the first Godfather. I don't love it enough for it to be one of my top 100 favorite movies of all time, but it's definitely a movie that I madly respect. But The Godfather Part 2 is even better. When people call this movie one of the greatest sequels of all time, they're not exaggerating. And another thing that this movie so expertly does is be both a sequel and a prequel at the same time. The prequel element of the movie, where we see the rise of Vito Corleone, played by Robert De Niro, is fantastic. Robert De Niro is excellent. And the sequel part of the movie, where we see the fall of Michael, is great as well. It's very emotional. It's suspenseful. Every single actor in this movie nails their role. And Francis Ford Coppola's direction is just fantastic. And another great thing about the movie is that even though it's over 3 hours long, because it's pretty much 2 movies in one, it's very well paced. You never feel like it goes on for too long. Just when you think the sequel portion is getting a little too long, it'll immediately go into the prequel portion. It's evenly paced out. It is expertly crafted. If I ever did a revised list of my top 100 favorite movies, I'm not quite sure if it would rank anywhere, but I'm so happy that I finally got to see this masterpiece for the first time. Number 1. Casablanca, or Casablanca. I don't know what there has to be said about this movie in the past 79 years that it's existed, other than it's one of the greatest films of all time. Much like with The Godfather Part 2, people do not exaggerate when they call this one of the greatest movies ever made. It's an amazing story. Humphrey Bogart is fantastic as the film's protagonist. His character's arc is very compelling, where he wants to try to stay out of the war. He wants to try to just forget about his past life because it's brought a lot of tragedy. But when Ingrid Bergman, as his former love interest, comes back into his life, his own life starts to take a turn. It's just a very, very compelling story, a great romance, and it has some great iconic lines to it. Again, I'm not sure what else has to be said about this movie that hasn't been said. It's a masterpiece, and the reason I put this specifically in the #1 spot, while I didn't want to rank any of the other movies in a certain order, is because I felt like this was the most important movie that I saw last year in terms of old classic Hollywood. I mean, Godfather Part 2 is fantastic. Some Like It Hot is great. Terms of Endearment, Cabaret, Arthur, they're all great movies. But I feel like none of those movies that I just talked about prior hold a candle to how important Casablanca is. So for that's why I feel like Casablanca was the best discovery that I made in 2020. So there you go. Those are my 10 favorite classic movies that I watched for the first time in 2020. But before I take off, I want to just bring up some honorable mentions, because there's a lot of other movies that I saw that I either have reviewed or haven't that I wanted to mention that I saw for the first time. A Star is Born from 1954, Paper Moon, For a Few Dollars More, Cleopatra, Adam's Rib, Tootsie, Dave, Romancing the Stone, The Last Picture Show, Battlefield Earth, Catwoman. Yeah, I didn't say these all had to be good, but Battlefield Earth and Catwoman are worth mentioning because they are considered some of the worst movies ever made, and I didn't expect to watch them for the first time in 2020. And then also, lastly, I watched the entire Friday the 13th series for the first time, so I think that's worth mentioning also. So there you go, those are my honorable mentions. That pretty much takes care of this video right here. I wanted to talk about the movies that I just watched for the first time last year, considering that movie theaters are still closed. So now I want to hear from you guys. Were there any movies that you recently saw for the first time that are considered classics? It doesn't exactly have to be because movie theaters are closed, just because, well, why not? You never saw these movies before and now you're correcting that error. Whatever the case may be, let me know in the comments below. And until next time, I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, leave a comment, support my Patreon page, follow me on social media. And until then, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you there's only one.